Sud, alors que le vent souffle toujours fortement sur le département, une centaine d'hectares ont d'ores et déjà brûlé selon la préfecture des Alpes-Maritimes. Sur le terrain.
Brennan, Gerard, and Ryan Kelly, you have been working together for 20 years, over 20 years as Gerard and Kelly. Your work spans performance, dance, film, installation, and other formats. So shortly after you arrived in France in 2018, you realized two important performances at iconic sites of modernist architecture. In 2019 at La Villa Savoie, masterpiece of Le Corbusier's, and Bright Hours at Cité Radieuse in Marseille. And you also engaged with the architecture of the Bourse du Commerce Pinot collection. Your exhibition at Le Carré d'Art in Nîmes in 2023, which was your first institutional exhibition in Europe. You entitled it Ruins, and in so doing, on the one hand side, consecrated, in my mind at least, the body of work that you had elaborated in relationship with the canon of modernist architecture as, you know, ruins of our artistic language, of our repertoire today, but also I think maybe not consciously at the time, you know, the kind of monumental foundations within your own work. I say this because we're sitting here, you know, in conversation in your recently opened exhibition, Marion Goodman in Paris, which really engages with this sedimentation that took place in your work, your critical engagement with this legacy of the modernist canon, but you're opening up a totally different body of work, and you're doing this once again by using a very critical title, Bardo. The spaces that we are in are sort of like a mise en abîme, both of your own work, but also, you know, of the ways in which you have engaged with space, and also preluding to a new past that you will be opening in the near future. We are sitting here on this piece of furniture, architecture, or space. I think a beautiful place to begin our dialogue because it's a bit of a microcosm of the exhibition in a way. It's a large piece of furniture, but a small piece of architecture, which really kind of creates a tension, a nucleus within the exhibition as a whole, and is of course related to your film E for Eileen, which you realized in 2024. So I wanted just to begin by opening up on this piece of architecture because it's really a place of tension. We're sitting here, we're already using it, we're already creating a dialogue, which is something that is happening with visitors when they enter. So I wanted to first hear you begin with, you know, how did you conceive this work and how it's related to E for Eileen?
Because you said a kind of mise en abîme, and I think it's really interesting. We're kind of paused on a still from the film. So this film, E for Eileen, is shot entirely at E1027, which is the home designed and built by Eileen Gray in, as you can tell, it's near the sea, so on the Mediterranean coast. And in this film, there's this one shot where you see the solarium, which is something that she constructed, which was designed for sunbathing, actually. It's a pool without water, it's outside. And we were very struck by this. We thought it was, in relationship to the other parts of the architecture, we thought of it almost like the signifying detail that actually speaks a lot about this site and the architecture that's not there. And we were very interested, and we made a series of installations for our films in which we were working with existing modernist furniture. But in this, we kind of were like, wow, well, so what can we do here that takes that idea further? So what this is, it is a rendering of the negative space of the solarium. And its materiality, it's covered in cork. And cork is a material that we find in certain pieces of furniture that Eileen Gray designed for the house. But it was also very interesting to us because it is a material that is relatively poor. It's not an expensive material. It is accessible. It is relatively ecological because to make the cork, you do not have to cut down the tree. The tree can still exist. And it has this effect of being both soft and sound absorbent. And I think for us, this furniture sculpture, the logic is related to her work because she was very interested in combining two things. For example, in her house, the windows that are kind of the accordion windows that open are both a paravent, like a screen, and a window. So we're very interested in this juxtaposition of two things. So this is both furniture and sculpture, both and neither nor, maybe a third thing that emerges. And for us, it implicates the body because it's not clear where to sit or how to occupy it. Also, in this house, which is very structured around kind of an individual, intimate relationship, this is the most social space. So for us, we were very aware that this is coming, the non-site of this gallery is social. And it is not a private space for one person. So we were thinking about what are the minimal conditions for creating a social encounter? What are the minimal conditions for creating an awareness of your body in space while watching the film? And the other thing that it does is it becomes a repository in this installation for light. During the film, there is a program of light that changes. And this also kind of allows us to have a focal point, screens the light. So it's serving multiple functions. But the other thing about it is I think it's kind of interesting because it's also kind of a mute object. It's not that complex, yet it serves a complexity of functions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely constantly in relation, I mean, of course, to the film while you're watching it. I think there's a very critical scene that unfolds specifically at the inverted, this inverted space. It's both like the rally point and the breakaway, point of all the social interactions within the film. But I think in the course of the exhibition, it also is the point that allows the visitor to have the consciousness of their body, whether or not they're seeing this scene in the film.
Totally.
And the one thing you didn't touch on that Béatrice had brought up is it is a one-to-one scale reproduction of an
Very
architectural
important,
element.
yes.
In the kind of vastly ambivalent status of what we're sitting on, I think also architecture is, as you said, the smallest architecture that we could lift from the house, which is something we've done in other installations. Even in the Carré d'Art, we had these paravents that were one-to-one scale and same materials as screens from the Schindler House, where we had worked in performance and film. So that, I do think it's also about architecture.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just go back to the actual film itself, and there is like this latency of action, definitely, that is here, and then that we see fictionalized, in the film. There's one kind of turning point that I had been meaning to, ask you about since I saw the film. From the very beginning, we see the protagonist, Eileen Gray, kind of using all the elements of the architecture, which you describe, that were important. This kind of idea of every object is both architecture, furniture, and the very personal relationship that we develop with objects in our home. And as you know, she's woken up very brutally by the arrival of others in the home. It's filled with beauty, this scene, because, you know, I think anybody can sort of recognize themselves in this reminder of, you know, sharing a space, which is like what visitors are doing on this pedestal seat space of a social space. But that moment, it's so visceral in the film, where the joy of deploying the architecture and the design to use of your own imagination is interrupted by having to negotiate the presence of the other lover, friend, partner, and I wanted to hear whether this was by design, that moment, and how you see its importance within the narrative of this exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, certainly when we approached the film, we were approaching it as a speculative fiction. So we rely on our research of the site, Eileen Gray, the historical characters Damia and Gian Badavici, to have information about how we then fictionalize what for us was the last day and a half that Eileen Gray would spend in this house. So in the balance of things, yes, historically Eileen Gray built the house. She lived there for 2 years with Gian Badavici. She left, she never came back. What might have driven this person to abandon her creation after living on site through its whole construction and then living there for 2 years? So she's clearly in the story of the film in a kind of crisis from the beginning, but then does, through engagement with her creation, with her house, with her furniture, with the play of natural elements that the house frames the experience of, she kind of collects herself. And this peace and tranquility is what's interrupted by the arrival of friends. So we really wanted these characters who were arriving, Damia and Bado, to be rude and abrasive, driven by their own desires and needs and the entanglement of relationships with Eileen and each other. Something that I think as the film goes on, we see Eileen has deep ambivalence about. She's drawn to these characters. I mean, it's starting to sound like an allegory for all social life, but it's like she wants to relate with Damia, the ex-lover, with Bado, the person with whom she lives, but also our Eileen, our speculative character, wants to be alone. Wants to be alone, I'd say, with her creation. And that's what was giving her this sense of tranquility and joy. There is no language spoken in the film before this moment, and it's quite far into the film. So we, at this point, we don't even know potentially what language Eileen Gray speaks. You know, like we really wanted to delay these, the arrival of language, I'd say, which gets so particular and specific immediately, even on a visual work. Like once the word is there, like the meaning just coheres.
Sutures around the word,
and then I'd say technically we played a lot in the post-production with sounds, so that we could really feel as spectators this sense of interruption to our own, perhaps, calm
like
engagement.
Our own reverie at that moment. Like their arrival does bring us back to where we are. And I think that I haven't really thought of this before, so it's a new idea, is that tension of being alone and with others, or being alone and intimate within a social space, I think is one very specific quality to the exhibition context, different from the cinema and completely different from performance. So if performance is thought of as the most social experience, collective, impossible to have a private, underived experience in performance, I think. Cinema, you have the illusion of being alone because you're in a dark room, but there are always others. the exhibition is very interesting to us, I think, as a medium or a format, because it is both. It is truly both. There are moments of the exhibition when you are truly alone and having a very individual encounter. But at the same time, especially in this work, it creates the conditions so a group can watch it. And I think it's part of what attracts me to exhibition.
Yeah.
As opposed to those other media, which are great, but I never have the complexity of experience that I'm seeking that I can have in an exhibition. So I think it does both things. It is both private and public.
Yes, I think you signal, no pun intended, but this very clearly at the entrance of the exhibition, which is on the ground floor with the Pasilla lamp detail, which is not a detail at all. It's an extremely important part of the fiction space, delimiting the fiction space of the exhibition, and then bringing together all the elements within. You know, of course, it appears very critically in the film, but I think it's also a very subtle material manifestation to what you are pointing to, which is it could be taken as a reference to performance and cinema, this idea that the show is about to start because when it blinks, film begins. But it being a very intimate, domestic design, then it becomes something completely different. And I think overall, it has a very powerful symbolism in terms of designating exhibition as time-based medium, which you are really, developing here.
Yeah, and it was a kind of crucial starting point for us too in thinking about the exhibition. The film was the only work that was completed when we started the exhibition, so everything else we created for the show, which was great, but it gave us the chance to really think about, okay, what are the particular conditions of this exhibition that is primarily underground? Thinking about even the dynamics of like how a visitor arrives to the gallery upstairs, their first encounters the communications desk, and we wanted to install this work that would function, as you say, to 2 minutes prior to the beginning of a sequence downstairs. The light would start to blink, which was our intervention in the light, and then it would remain on for 22 minutes while the film ran, and then would go dark for 8 minutes during what we've thought of as a kind of interlude, when the image is not projected, but we've designed sound and light to perform in the space, a kind of minimal disco is what we're thinking about, connecting from the film to where we are going in our work next. But your engagement with the installation, with the exhibition, is still up to you. It's your choice. I'm equally interested in the visitor who enters this exhibition when there's no film being projected, when there's no image. That's very exciting to me.
In the interval.
Interval, yeah.
I also think that the title of the work is important because it's called Défense du Rire, which is with what is stenciled on the wall. So it's marking time. It does mark time. It makes it temporal, as you were saying. It incorporates language that is an injunction. It's no laughing, which it makes you laugh. I think by putting this object, which comes from the house, into a gallery, we're kind of doing a ready-made operation, assisted ready-made operation, because now it's becoming a program. In that operation, we realize the joke even more of the phallic nature of the object, which puts us, I think, into the sense of humor of Eileen Gray, and also kind of undercuts the object in a way. Like the laughing at the object also takes away its power, which is kind of interesting to me. And that we're installing it next to the communication desk in a place where artworks aren't usually installed, but it absolutely is the first encounter. It is your first phenomenological encounter with your artwork. And for me, that is a very important thing not to control, but to make part of the fiction that is the exhibition.
Yes, it crystallizes what is happening in the exhibition, this idea of a threshold. It's also physically the doorway, this idea of passage, and our other idea of what is the bardo. How does bardo kind of allow us to think about what is an exhibition and what is the exhibition for?
Yeah, I think the title of this exhibition, Bardo, functions at several different levels for us. I do think it's a reflection on, or it's a proposal for what might be an exhibition, like the status of an exhibition. Is every exhibition potentially a bardo? The notion of bardo comes from an 8th century Tibetan text discovered in the 14th or 15th century, had literally been buried in Tibet, was unearthed. And this text describes speculatively, or quasi-speculatively, what happens at the moment of death and the period of time immediately following death before the eventual rebirth or possible transcendence from this cycle of death and rebirth. The bardo is a text for liberation through hearing or through understanding. The idea of a liberatory practice, bardoing, felt very connected to us also in how we think about queerness as a process of an approach to living that's always seeking like deeper and deeper liberation. So I think the bardo we could also constitute it without a doubt as a queer space and a queer temporality, which is also an exciting proposition for what the exhibition space might be. Something that is resistant to a linear time or to let's say a normative use of space or a normative way of looking and listening.
And also beyond representation.
Beyond
representation, absolutely.
Because what's described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the dissolution of self.
We were talking about the crypt and this notion of like an alternative sanctuary in a way. And it's accidental but nice that it's called crypt.
Totally.
You have installed glory hole in this gallery or space or bardo. Or how to say, testing ground for what does a liberating exhibition space look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, that space...
That it is called the crypt.
It's called the crypt. It's called the crypt. At Marion Goodman Gallery in Paris, that is a very charged space for me. I also think it is one of the, perhaps like the solarium, how it functions in our reading of E1027, that space is kind of the detail of the space of this gallery that says so much about what's there and what's not there. It was probably once a kitchen, but it's been called over time, called a crypt, you know? In this space, we've chosen to install Glory Hole, which is basically, it's very similar to Défense du Rire in structure. There's a ready-made, which is a disco ball, a black disco ball. And in this work, it is also time-based because the disco ball, which has replaced the head of a rendering, a representation of St. Francis. So it is constantly spinning. So the other characteristic of the bardo is that, you know, we've talked about how it is a liminal space. It's at the threshold of existence. It's a multisensory space. A lot of times it's about sound. So it is, like the exhibition, a multisensory space. The other thing about it is one wonders, you wander in the bardo for an indeterminate amount of time. Apparently, it's described as constant movement and change. So you are not still. So this disco ball, which is constantly turning, is part of this wandering for us of being in a space at the threshold of something. It is continuous. And the very specific representation that is flickering, too, is, I would think, we're bringing things together that would not normally be brought together. Mm-hmm. There is this rendering of St. Francis, which comes from a painting from which we only see the back of this figure. St. Francis receiving the Stigmata by Pasolino, which is a painting that is in the Louvre collection. So it's bringing the disco ball into this space of a devotional work, right? Depicting a passage of the saint, life of the saint. But for us, in this moment of Stigmata, which is what Pasolino is depicting, for us, this is a very queer moment, because this spiritual presence, or God, has literally penetrated your body. So for Francis, it was through his hand to replicate the suffering of Christ on the cross. Yeah. But it is literally another source that comes and penetrates, goes inside of you, mm-hmm. in your body. It's corporal. So it's something is penetrating you from a source that you don't know, right? And it transforms you. And for us, the Stigmata is so close to the idea of stigma, which is what queer people have been struggling with for hundreds of years, right? The stigma of their choice to liberate themselves, and how the transformation of that stigma into a source of pleasure, maybe, mm-hmm. into a source of power, is still a mystery, right? So I think that the disco ball is circling around these very powerful representations, but also these experiences that I think a lot of people can identify with.
I might add to Glory Hole that I think in terms of the exhibition system, its mm-hmm. particular placement, certainly in the crypt, is evocative, but also at the end. I don't know that everyone goes there, because the exhibition is also in shadow, emerges from dark. Everything is a light source. Mm-hmm. So they could miss it. And if they don't miss it, and they do make their way around the corridor and encounter the other two light boxes, which we can talk about too, there's a frisson, perhaps, of unexpected encounters. And the spiral of the projected light sends you around, and the fact that it's a sculpture in the center of the room, you move around, and then you spiral your way back up and out mm-hmm. through the galleries. What's the site, the discursive site of that object? I mean, you have Catholicism, mm-hmm. St. Francis, the first saint to receive the Stigmata. You have Bardo, because we framed this to be, but by entitling the exhibition Bardo, we're asking you to think about the object through a specific cultural framework mm-hmm. of Tibetan Buddhism. So already, Catholicism and Tibetan Buddhism, what are they doing together? Buddhism and Catholicism, two practices that are also very constitutive of the two of us mm-hmm. and important to each of us. And then the third element of disco, because mm-hmm. of the ball, otherwise a black automobile paint, super slick and reflective, much like the ball itself. So then we're asking, what does the disco have to do with St. Francis? And then you've titled the piece Glory Hall, which has a very specific connotation to sex practices that might happen in a dark room, mm-hmm. just like the crypt. When we put these different signifieds together, I think we're starting to point to a discursive space that we're very interested, and that might refer back to our relationship to Eileen, mm-hmm. because I think we're starting to think about the kind of iconography of, what might a queer spirituality look like? Mm-hmm. How might it construct itself from the ruins of so many other ideas and discourses, the mm-hmm. ruin of Catholicism or Buddhism or disco. And that I think is what this sculpture is trying to cohere around.
Yes, the ruin and also the opportunity of the ruin in the sense that it's ontologically like evanescent. It's something that is moving back into the ground. That is like, but that is also an opportunity of projecting onto. In a way, when you look at a ruin, you can imagine building anything that you want on top of it. So I think there's a very utopian kind of idea that emerges both, when you're going through this sort of circumambulating, which is nice, also referring to the practice in Buddhism of like, walking around sculpture,
meditation,
but emerging back onto that, a very kind of positive, joyful resource.
When you go to the crypt, everyone is in shadow except for the disco ball and the sculpture. But then you emerge back from there and you kind of go back up to what we're thinking in the third space as the end of the exhibition, which is very joyful. And in that part of the exhibition, we're actually kind of making these images, representations, many different layers of dancers into saints, like we're kind of sanctifying them. So there's a kind of exaltation that happens after the experience of this bardo, which I didn't think about before in terms of the narrative of the show.
It also could be the beginning of the show too.
It totally could be. It's both the beginning and the end in a way. Yeah.
But I before we talk about that, I wanted to just say something about the light boxes and the other elements in this exhibition that are relating to E1027 and more particularly to Eileen Gray as well. And the choice to make them as light boxes, or in the case of Solarium Ensoleillé, that it has its own light source. I do think we thought of these as kind of chapels. I think that arrived really in the process of determining to diffuse them throughout the space so that they also kind of travel you, including to engage in the corridor space, which is often considered a transitional space, so like the threshold of the entry door, and to let each one invite you to a moment of truly personal and private contemplation and viewership, as a counterpoint to the collectivity of watching the film. It was also a bit of like good luck that we encountered the source objects of the light boxes. We'd been working at the Centre Pompidou 2 years ago otherwise, and it was at just the time that the niece of Eileen Gray delivered a few boxes of personal affairs that kind of surprised everyone because Gray had famously burned her affairs. And we were drawn to several of the photographs, images in this box, and working with the bibliothèque, we reshot them and printed them on transparency so that we could intervene with gouache, which is a material that Gray worked with, usually in her drawings, like her preparatory phase of work. And we were interested in a color palette that would remind us of E1027. So we were drawn in souvenir to this image of a lonely empty chair on the balcony, a chair that's usually indoors. So it was clearly a staged image. It might be the only image that archivally that Gray might have taken herself. Why don't you tell the story of Monsieur Gray?
So there was an envelope inside of this box,
right,
at the Bibliothèque Kandinsky, which was addressed to Monsieur Gray. And I was immediately drawn to it because I knew that Eileen had a gallery under a man's name called Jean Désert, that she was part of a circle of a kind of lesbian life of the teens and 20s, in which women would very often dress like men. So there was a play of gender that was definitely queer at the beginning of the 20th century, you know? And so that she kept this letter. There's only one letter, and she kept it as addressed to Monsieur Gray. Just the fact that it's there, I thought was very
Meaning
interesting.
it was mistaken.
Yeah, well, perhaps. We don't know. What is it? You know, it's that thing about the archive. Is it an accident or is it actually a signifying detail, right?
Yes.
And inside of the envelope was a very strange picture of a pelican sculpture, Aztec. It's an actual print.
Sent from
Mexico, yeah, to her.
So she had requested
this image maybe for an exhibition or maybe to buy. What the Lightbox allows us to do is have two transparencies. So it allows us to almost have an X-ray into the contents of the envelope. So I think all of these works, they're at the border between the public and the private. I do sense that it was part of what I needed to do was recreate the experience that I had in the archive, encountering a person, like to recreate that intimacy, which is at the border of trespass and love and care. And I wanted to preserve that feeling before it had settled into information, maybe. And I think that's what these works are trying to also document, is that encounter.
Yes, it's very important, like a question that you're, positioning within the exhibition, the status of private part of the archive, and I think you are, investigating this also in your work with the partitions of Gay Gorilla by Julian Eastman, which we see in the viewing room upstairs.
I think what we're doing there is we're working with images we took of the ceiling of the Pompidou when we were working there for another project. So it is quite flat. And we're separating the color schema of the Pompidou and using it not necessarily aligned to the elements that we're working with. So it's in this logic of our, what we call glyphs, this kind of recutting of our own imagery, working with silkscreen and stencils in that case to create a new composition. There are the bodies of dancers in movement, falling, spiraling, also breaking apart and kind of incorporating with the elements of the architecture. I think proposing something at least about the Pompidou as itself a kind of body that breathes and moves, which is quite evident in that particular architecture. The neon initially coming from the Pompidou itself, and the red neon that was part of its original design, and the other element being the hand-drawn transcriptions of fragments of Julius Eastman's score, Gay Gorilla, which also from the late 70s is kind of the same time as the Pompidou. So we're kind of thinking about the Pompidou, I'd say, within this idea of disco minimalism that's kind of been a useful tool for us thinking formally. Disco Saint, which also uses the Pompidou architecture, but we've reduced it to the color schema to metallics, and we're working on a black dye bronze surface. I would agree with Brennan in these works and in the ongoing glyph series, which are smaller on metallic papers. We're very interested in this figure of the dancer as a kind of both completely human and incarnate and precarious, like literally physically precarious subject, and also one who has the capacity to defy the normal conventions of how we use our bodies in space. And I feel like there's something in that both like completely human and potentially godly status of the dancer that is interesting for us in the iconography that we're starting to work with.
But in the word glyph, there's also a very beautiful ambiguity about the nature of that writing. Like, is it sacred, or is it like scribbling? It's still just like a bit like the ambiguity in Bardo. And this is, I think, you know, beautiful kind of link with the other archives that you're treating.
I think maybe some of the exuberance that we see in Pompidou Pulse, in some of the glyphs, what is it? Is it like the moment, because in the Bardo, people talk about bodies and the bodies dissolve. But I really think, but then I was like, well, maybe what we're talking about is abstraction, to go back to this beyond representation. The joy of abstraction. Also, that the abstraction as a democratic language, you do not have to read music to understand the music as a glyph, right? To see the writing of these notes on a page as a composition. There's something, I think, about abstraction that may give us that freedom. It might feel like joy. And I think we're not thinking of, when we're making the works, we're not thinking about abstraction, because we're actually doing a series of operations that are very time intensive and labor intensive. But I think what we're going for is, I think that like where we're trying to head is this kind of abstraction.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Beatrice. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.